The freezing Montana wind didn't care that Etta was a grieving widow, nor did the debt collectors who chased her from town. With 2 starving children and pennies to her name, she knocked on the door of the most feared mountain man in the territory. It was her last resort. The autumn of 1884 was merciless in the Bitterroot Valley. Henrietta Etta Miller clutched the frayed collar of her wool coat, shivering as the borrowed wagon rattled over the frozen, rutted trail. Beside her, huddled beneath a moth-eaten blanket, were her 2 reasons for breathing, 9-year-old Toby and 6-year-old Clara. Their lips were tinged blue, their eyes wide with a quiet, enduring terror that broke Etta's heart with every jolt of the wagon wheels. Etta was not a woman built for running. She was a large, heavy-set woman, possessing a broad frame carrying the soft, substantial weight that had once been a sign of a prosperous baker's wife. But when her husband, Arthur, succumbed to consumption the previous winter, that prosperity vanished overnight. Arthur had secretly remortgaged their small bakery in Bozeman to pay for medical tonics, leaving Etta at the mercy of Hiram Fletcher, a ruthless local banker who delighted in collecting debts. Fletcher had given her 2 choices: surrender her children to the county orphanage and work in his boarding house for free to pay off the debt, or face the winter streets. Etta chose the wilderness. Crushed by the town's whispering mockery of the fat, destitute widow, she had torn a weather-beaten advertisement from the mercantile board. Cook wanted, Bitterroot Ridge, room and board, no faint hearts. The name at the bottom was scrawled in violent, heavy ink. Gideon Cobb. The townsfolk spoke of Gideon Cobb in hushed, frightened tones. He was a mountain man who had descended from the high peaks to claim a sprawling, isolated ranch. They said he was half grizzly, a man who spoke only in grunts and gunfire, and that the last 3 cooks had fled his ranch in tears. Etta didn't care if the man was the devil himself. The devil had food, and Etta's children were starving. The wagon groaned to a halt before a massive, rough-hewn log cabin that looked more like a fortress than a home. The surrounding ranch was vast, silent, and shadowed by the jagged teeth of the mountains. Etta climbed down, her knees aching under her weight as she hit the frozen dirt. She took a deep breath, smoothing her faded apron, and marched up the wooden steps. Before her knuckles could even graze the heavy oak, the door was wrenched open. Etta gasped, instinctively taking a step back. Gideon Cobb was a giant. He towered over Etta's already substantial height, his shoulders filling the doorway. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, and a jagged white scar cut violently through his left eyebrow. He wore buckskin and heavy canvas, smelling of pine pitch, raw leather, and sweat. His eyes, a startling, piercing steel gray, locked onto Etta. "I didn't order a woman," Gideon rumbled, his voice like grinding stones, "and I sure as hell didn't order children." His gaze flicked to the wagon where Toby and Clara peeked over the wooden siding. "My name is Henrietta Miller," Etta said, forcing her trembling voice to steady. She stood tall, refusing to shrink herself as she usually did when men stared at her size. "I saw your notice at the mercantile. I am a cook, the best you'll ever find." Gideon's eyes raked over her, stopping on her worn, muddy boots and the obvious heavy exhaustion clinging to her large frame. "You won't last a week. It's hard work here. Not suited for city women. Go back to Bozeman." He moved to shut the door. Etta slammed her large palm flat against the wood, stopping it. The impact echoed sharply in the frigid air. Gideon's eyes narrowed dangerously, a silent threat vibrating in his tense muscles. "I have nothing to go back to, Mr. Cobb," Etta said, her voice dropping to a fierce, desperate whisper. "My children haven't had a hot meal in 4 days. You need a cook. I need a stove. Give me 1 hour. If the food I put in front of you isn't the best you've ever tasted, we will get back in that wagon and freeze on the trail. But you will give me that hour." For a long, agonizing moment, Gideon just stared at her. He saw the sheer, feral desperation of a mother backed into a corner. With a heavy scoff, he stepped aside. "Kitchen's in the back. The stove is cold. You've got 60 minutes, Widow Miller." Etta wasted no time. She practically ran to the wagon, hauling her small crate of personal spices and her heavy iron skillet. She ushered Toby and Clara inside, tucking them into a corner of the massive, dimly lit kitchen. The place was a disaster, pots caked with old grease, flour dusted over every surface, smelling faintly of burnt meat and neglect. But Etta felt a surge of life. This was her domain. She moved with a surprising, fluid grace for a woman of her size. She chopped firewood with precise, heavy swings, stoked the massive cast-iron stove, and found Gideon's meager supplies. In 55 minutes, she had revived the kitchen. When Gideon walked in, he stopped dead in his tracks. The suffocating smell of bachelor grime was gone, replaced by the heavenly, rich aroma of rendered bacon fat, sizzling onions, and fresh dough. On the scrubbed wooden table sat a towering stack of golden, flaky buttermilk biscuits, a cast-iron skillet bubbling with thick, peppered venison gravy, and a pot of dark, strong coffee. Gideon sat down slowly. He picked up a biscuit, pulled it apart, steam rising from the fluffy center, and dragged it through the gravy. He took a bite. Etta held her breath, her hands twisting her apron into knots. Toby and Clara watched with wide, fearful eyes from the corner. Gideon chewed in silence. He didn't say a word. He just kept eating. He cleared the entire plate, drank 2 cups of coffee, and wiped his mouth with the back of his massive hand. He stood up, towering over Etta once more, his expression completely unreadable. "The boy can sleep in the loft," Gideon grunted, turning toward the door. "You and the girl take the room off the pantry. Breakfast is at 5 sharp. He walked out, plunging the house back into silence. Etta slumped against the counter, burying her face in her hands as silent tears of absolute relief soaked her palms. They had survived. The first 3 weeks at the Bitterroot Ridge Ranch were grueling. The Montana winter arrived with a vengeance, burying the valley in 2 feet of snow and dropping the temperature to a bone-chilling ache. True to his reputation, Gideon Cobb was a ghost in his own home. He left before dawn to tend to his cattle and mend fences, returning well after dark, coated in frost and smelling of horses and cold wind. He never spoke. He communicated in nods, grunts, and the occasional sharp point of a finger. Etta quickly learned that Gideon was a man entirely disconnected from human softness. Yet, Etta was determined to bring warmth to the frozen cabin. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. She mended Gideon's torn work shirts, folding them neatly at the foot of his door, and she cooked like her life depended on it, because it did. She roasted tough cuts of beef until they fell apart at the touch of a fork, baked heavy loaves of sourdough bread, and made rich, spiced apple cobblers from the cellar's dried fruit reserves. Etta's body, always a subject of town ridicule, became her greatest asset here. Her broad shoulders and heavy arms carried endless buckets of water, chopped cords of wood, and wrestled with the massive iron stove without complaint. But the silence in the cabin was suffocating for the children. Toby, deeply traumatized by his father's death and their eviction, was fiercely protective of his mother. He glared at Gideon from the shadows, convinced the giant mountain man would hurt them. Clara, on the other hand, was just a ghost. A quiet, frail little thing who hid beneath the kitchen table, playing with a small, faceless rag doll. Etta worried constantly. "Toby, please," she whispered one evening, scrubbing a pot as her son stubbornly blocked the pantry door while Gideon ate in the dining room. "Don't stare at him so angrily. He gave us a home." "He's mean, Ma," Toby muttered, his small fists clenched. "He looks at you like you're just one of his draft horses." "He looks at me like a woman who earns her keep," Etta corrected gently, wiping flour from her plump cheek. "And that is exactly what I am." But Etta couldn't deny that Gideon's icy demeanor was unsettling. He never acknowledged the children. If Clara accidentally dropped a tin cup, Gideon would freeze, his scarred face tightening, before he abruptly stood and walked out into the cold, leaving his meal half-finished. Etta feared he was simply biding his time until he decided they were too much trouble and threw them out. The turning point came on a blinding, snowy Tuesday afternoon in late November. Etta was in the root cellar, wrestling a heavy sack of potatoes, while Clara was supposed to be sitting on the porch, wrapped in a quilt. Suddenly, Etta heard Toby scream. It wasn't a playful shout, it was a shriek of raw, piercing terror. Etta dropped the sack, her heart slamming against her ribs, and scrambled up the cellar stairs. She burst out the back door into the blinding white snow. Toby was standing near the edge of the barn, brandishing a pitchfork, his face pale with horror. Cornered against the frozen water trough was Clara, sobbing hysterically. Pacing just 10 feet away from the little girl was a massive, gaunt mountain lion. Driven mad by the early winter and starvation, the predator had crept right into the yard. Its yellow eyes were locked onto the small child, its tail flicking in a deadly, hypnotic rhythm. "Clara!" Etta screamed, lunging forward, her heavy boots sinking deep into the snowdrifts. She was too far away. The mountain lion's muscles coiled, its jaw opening in a low, terrifying hiss, preparing to spring. Crack! A gunshot shattered the icy air with deafening force. The mountain lion jerked violently, collapsing mid-pounce into the snow, thrashing for a brief second before going completely still. Etta fell to her knees in the snow, sliding the rest of the way to Clara, and pulling the hysterical girl into her large, soft chest. She buried her face in Clara's hair, crying out to God in relief. Toby dropped the pitchfork, trembling uncontrollably. Etta looked up. Standing on the porch, the smoking barrel of a Winchester rifle still raised to his shoulder, was Gideon. He wasn't wearing his heavy coat, he had run out in just his undershirt and suspenders. His face was a mask of cold, lethal fury. But as he lowered the rifle, Etta saw something else in his gray eyes. Panic. Raw, unadulterated panic. Gideon didn't say a word. He turned on his heel, walked back into the house, and slammed the door. That night, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Etta served dinner in complete silence. Her hands shook as she placed a thick slice of venison pie in front of Gideon. She fully expected him to slide an envelope of wages across the table and tell them to leave. Having children on the ranch was clearly a deadly liability. Gideon stared at his plate. The fire crackled in the hearth. Toby and Clara were huddled in the pantry, too scared to come out. "Mr. Cobb," Etta finally said, her voice cracking. She wrung her large hands in her apron. I have no words to thank you, but if you want us gone tomorrow, I understand. I should have been watching her closer. I'm so sorry." Gideon slowly looked up. The firelight cast deep shadows over his scarred face. He stared at Etta, at her tear-stained cheeks, her shaking shoulders, and the absolute heartbreak in her eyes. For the first time, he didn't look through her. He looked at her. He reached into his heavy canvas pocket and pulled something out, setting it gently on the wooden table. It was a small, perfectly carved wooden horse. The edges were smoothed down, the mane detailed with tiny, precise cuts. "Tell the girl," Gideon said, his voice a low, raspy gravel, "that the big cats don't come near the house when the hounds are out. I'll keep the hounds out from now on." Etta stared at the wooden toy, a fresh wave of tears springing to her eyes. You carved this?" Gideon abruptly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He cleared his throat, suddenly looking extremely uncomfortable. "Pie needs more salt," he grunted, turning his back to her and retreating to his room. Etta stood alone in the kitchen, holding the little wooden horse. The pie didn't need salt, but as she looked toward Gideon's closed door, Etta realized for the first time that the terrifying mountain man of Bitterroot Ridge wasn't a monster at all. He was just a man who had forgotten how to live among the living. And maybe, just maybe, her family could help him remember. The little wooden horse changed everything. It didn't happen overnight, but as the brutal Montana winter of 1884 dragged into December, a quiet shift settled over the cabin. Clara, who had spent her first weeks hiding like a frightened mouse, began to emerge from the shadows. The morning after the mountain lion incident, Etta found Clara sitting on the braided rug near the hearth, the wooden horse clutched tightly in her small hands. When Gideon tramped into the kitchen for breakfast, shaking snow from his massive shoulders, Clara didn't scurry away. Instead, she slid a perfectly round, warm buttermilk biscuit across the table toward his empty plate. Gideon stopped. He stared at the biscuit, then down at the 6-year-old girl. His scarred face remained stoic, but he gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. He ate the biscuit first. From that day on, an unspoken ritual was born. Wherever Gideon left his heavy leather work gloves to dry near the stove, Clara would ensure a small piece of dried fruit or a warm roll was waiting inside one of them. Toby's resentment was harder to melt. The 9-year-old boy felt a desperate need to be the man of the house, a role he believed Gideon was usurping. The tension broke during a blinding 3-day blizzard that trapped them all indoors. The barn roof began to groan under the weight of the snow, and Gideon had to brace the support beams. He looked at Etta, then at Toby. "Boy," Gideon rumbled, his voice cutting through the howling wind outside. "Grab the lantern. I need a second set of hands." Toby puffed out his chest, terrified but determined, and followed the giant man into the freezing whiteout. Etta paced the kitchen floor for 2 hours, her hands white-knuckled as she kneaded bread dough, praying for their safe return. When the back door finally slammed open, Toby was shivering violently, covered in snow, but his eyes were shining with a bright, fierce pride. "Ma, I helped brace the main beam," Toby announced, his teeth chattering. "Mr. Cobb said I tie a better knot than half the ranch hands in Bozeman." Etta looked up at Gideon. The mountain man was brushing ice from his thick beard, but as his steel-gray eyes met hers, she saw a fleeting, unmistakable warmth. "He did good," Gideon grunted, turning to hang his coat. "He's got a strong back. He'll make a fair hand." That evening the kitchen felt different. It wasn't just a place of survival anymore. It was a home. Etta, whose large, substantial frame had always drawn cruel stares and whispers of gluttony from the town gossips, found herself moving with a newfound pride. Here, her broad shoulders meant she could haul enough wood to keep her children warm. Her soft, heavy arms meant she could wrestle the stubborn cast-iron stove and produce meals that kept the fierce cold at bay. And Gideon noticed. He watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. He watched the way the firelight caught the perspiration on her brow as she roasted mutton and spiced dried cherries. He watched how her laughter, a deep, rich, booming sound that Etta had suppressed since Arthur's death, began to echo off the log walls when Toby told a joke. Gideon had spent 5 years punishing himself in the silent, frozen high country. But Etta Miller was a force of nature, a blazing hearth fire that refused to be extinguished. However, the outside world had not forgotten them. In late February, the snow finally began to recede, leaving a sea of treacherous, freezing mud. A traveling postal rider stopped at the ranch to water his horse and brought news from Bozeman. As Etta served the man a bowl of thick potato stew, he spoke of the changing territory. "Fletcher is buying up everything he can," the rider said between mouthfuls, referring to the ruthless banker, Hiram Fletcher. "He's got backing from the Northern Pacific Railway now, and word is he's selling off foreclosed lands to Conrad Coors, the big cattle king up north. Fletcher's getting filthy rich." Etta's blood ran cold at the mention of Fletcher. Her hands trembled, rattling the tin coffee pot against the stove. The rider wiped his mouth, oblivious to Etta's panic. "Matter of fact, Fletcher's got a bounty out on a woman. A widow who skipped town owing him a massive debt on a bakery. Claims she stole his property. He's hired a pair of Pinkerton men to track her down. Says the law gives him the right to take her kids for indentured labor if she can't pay." Etta dropped the coffee pot. It clattered loudly against the iron grate, spilling scalding dark liquid across the floor. Gideon, who had been sitting quietly in the corner oiling his rifle, stopped, his piercing eyes locked onto Etta's pale, terrified face. He slowly stood up, his massive frame towering over the small kitchen, and looked at the postal rider. "You talk too much," Gideon said softly. It wasn't a shout, but the absolute, lethal calm in his voice made the rider pale and scramble out the door without finishing his stew. Once they were alone, the silence in the cabin was suffocating. Etta sagged against the counter, burying her face in her hands. The nightmare wasn't over. It had simply been delayed. That night, the wind howled a mournful tune around the eaves of the cabin. Etta didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the pantry room, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of Toby and Clara. She could not let Fletcher take her children. She could not let her past drag Gideon into a bloody gunfight with Pinkerton men. She had brought warmth to this man's home. She refused to bring death to his doorstep. With trembling hands, Etta packed her worn carpet bag. She gathered her spices, wrapped 2 loaves of bread in brown paper, and gently shook Toby awake. "Get your sister," she whispered, tears burning her eyes. "We have to go." "Ma, it's dark," Toby mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "I know, baby, I know, but we can't stay." 10 minutes later, Etta quietly opened the heavy front door, the bitter night air stinging her face. She stepped onto the porch, clutching Clara's hand, Toby trailing behind. But as they moved toward the barn to saddle the borrowed wagon mule, a massive shadow detached itself from the side of the house. "Where exactly do you think you're going, Etta?" Etta gasped, clutching her chest. Gideon stood in the snow, wearing his heavy buckskin coat, a lit cigar glowing dimly in his jaw. He looked like a mountain spirit, immovable and furious. "Mr. Cobb." "Gideon," Etta stammered, tears finally spilling over her plump cheeks. "I have to leave. Fletcher is looking for me. My husband. He signed a paper before he died. He put the children up as collateral for the bakery's debt. It was illegal, but Fletcher owns the judge. If his men find me here, they will take Toby and Clara, and they will kill you if you try to stop them." Gideon took a slow drag of his cigar, the red ember illuminating the jagged white scar across his eye. "Let them try." "No," Etta cried softly, stepping toward him, her large frame shaking with desperate sorrow. "You don't understand. You gave us a winter of peace. You kept my babies alive. I will not repay your kindness by bringing a war to your home. We are leaving." Gideon stepped forward, closing the distance between them. For the first time, Etta saw the deep, agonizing pain beneath his stony exterior. He reached out, his massive, calloused hands gently gripping her broad shoulders. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with a fierce, possessive reverence. 5 years ago, Gideon's voice rasped, cracking with an emotion Etta had never heard from him. "My wife and my little boy caught the winter fever. I rode through a blizzard for 3 days to get a doctor. When I got back, they were gone. I went crazy, Etta. Walked into the woods looking to die. Found a grizzly instead. The bear gave me this scar, but it didn't kill me. I've been a ghost ever since." Gideon's grip tightened, his thumbs brushing the heavy wool of her coat. "Then you showed up. You brought the smell of fresh bread. You brought laughter. You brought life back into this graveyard of a house. You are a strong, beautiful woman, Etta Miller, and I am not losing my family a second time." Etta sobbed, her hands coming up to grip his thick wrists. Before she could speak, the distant, unmistakable sound of horses churning through the frozen mud echoed up the valley. Dawn was breaking, casting a pale gray light over the Bitterroot Ridge. Through the lifting mist, 3 riders appeared on the trail leading up to the cabin. Etta's heart stopped. At the front of the pack was a sharp-faced man wearing a bowler hat and a heavy wool duster, one of Fletcher's hired guns. "Get the children inside," Gideon ordered, his voice instantly dropping to a deadly, emotionless calm. "Lock the door." Etta rushed Toby and Clara into the house, but she refused to shut the door completely. She stood in the threshold, her hands gripping her heavy iron skillet, her breathing shallow and ragged. The riders halted 10 yards from the porch. The lead man smirked, looking at the giant mountain man standing on the wooden steps. "Morning," the man drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Name's Cole. Looking for a fat widow by the name of Etta Miller. Word in town is she's cooking for you. She owes my boss, Hiram Fletcher, $300. Or the kids." Gideon didn't move. He stood with his feet planted shoulder-width apart, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He hadn't brought his rifle. "She ain't here," Gideon said, his voice like grinding granite. Cole laughed harshly, unbuttoning his duster to reveal the heavy revolver strapped to his hip. "Don't lie to me, mountain man. I can smell bacon frying. Now, You're going to step aside, or I'm going to leave you bleeding in your own front yard. You work for Fletcher, Gideon stated, ignoring the threat. Fletcher works with the Northern Pacific, selling to Conrad Coors. Cole frowned, his hand resting on his gun butt. So what if he does? Gideon reached slowly into his inner coat pocket. Cole drew his revolver halfway, but Gideon just pulled out a folded, wax-sealed piece of heavy parchment. He tossed it into the mud at Cole's horse's feet. "Pick it up," Gideon commanded. One of Cole's men dismounted, scooped up the paper, and handed it to Cole. Cole broke the seal, his eyes scanning the writing. As he read, his arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden, sickening pallor. He looked up at Gideon in absolute shock. Who are you?" Cole stammered. "I sold 3,000 head of cattle to Conrad Coors 5 years ago before I moved to this ridge," Gideon said, his voice booming across the quiet valley. "Coors still owes me a final dividend. That paper is a drafted lien on Hiram Fletcher's bank, backed by Coors' own attorneys. You tell Fletcher that Etta Miller's debt is paid, and you tell him that if he or any of his men ever look in the direction of the Bitterroot Ridge again, I won't send paper. I'll bring lead." Cole swallowed hard. He shoved the paper into his coat pocket, yanked his horse's reins, and shouted at his men. They spurred their horses, tearing back down the trail as fast as the muddy ground would allow. The silence rushed back in. Etta stood in the doorway, completely stunned, the heavy iron skillet slipping from her trembling fingers to clatter against the floorboards. Gideon turned around. The terrifying, lethal aura melted away as he looked at her. He walked slowly up the stairs, taking Etta's soft, flour-dusted hands in his giant, calloused ones. "Breakfast?" Gideon asked softly, a tiny, rare smile pulling at the corner of his scarred mouth. Etta let out a wet, booming laugh that echoed through the pines. She leaned forward, resting her head against his massive chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of a heart that had finally thawed. "Yes, Gideon," she whispered. Breakfast. The weeks following the tense confrontation brought a breathtaking spring to the Bitterroot Valley. The snows melted into rushing creeks, and vibrant pink bitterroot flowers pushed triumphantly through the thawing earth. Inside the cabin, a beautiful rebirth had taken root. Gideon Cobb, the terrifying mountain man of local legend, was gone. In his place was a man whose actions roared with devotion. He built a sturdy pine bed for Toby, spending evenings teaching the boy how to whittle safely. He brought Clara wild mountain strawberries, his calloused thumbs gently wiping the red juice from her chin when she smiled. And for Etta, he felled a massive oak and built a reinforced table for her kitchen, large enough to hold her sprawling baking projects and sturdy enough to accommodate the joyous rhythm of her rolling pin. Gideon worshipped Etta. Where the cruel townspeople of Bozeman had endlessly mocked her broad hips and heavy arms, Gideon saw only strength, abundance, and irreplaceable warmth. He would stand quietly in the doorway, covered in dirt and horse sweat, watching her knead heavy sourdough with a quiet, burning reverence. Etta found herself wearing her substantial size, like a crown. She was the undisputed queen of this wild ridge, the beating heart that pumped life through the rough-hewn log walls. But peace in the Montana Territory was a fragile thing, and a cornered beast is always the most dangerous. Down in Bozeman, Hiram Fletcher's crooked empire was crumbling. Gideon's drafted lien had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. Conrad Coors' ruthless attorneys aggressively audited Fletcher's bank, uncovering years of illegal foreclosures and forged deeds. The Northern Pacific Railway abruptly pulled their backing. By late May of 1885, Fletcher was a ruined man, facing federal indictment and total financial loss. Driven completely mad by his spectacular fall, Fletcher blamed only one man, Gideon Cobb. And the desperate banker was not going to prison without pulling Gideon down with him. It happened on a muggy Tuesday afternoon. Gideon had taken Toby 3 miles up the ridge to repair cattle fencing. Clara was napping peacefully, Etta was entirely alone in the kitchen, humming a soulful hymn as she rendered beef tallow in a massive cast-iron cauldron on the stove. Suddenly, the heavy wooden front door was kicked violently off its iron hinges, the thick wood splintering with an explosive crack. Etta spun around. Standing in the ruined doorway, soaked in sweat and trembling with deranged fury, was Hiram Fletcher. His fine silk suit was torn and caked in drying mud, his face gaunt, and in his trembling right hand he held a fully cocked Colt peacemaker. "You," Fletcher spat, his bloodshot eyes fixed on Etta's imposing figure. "You thieving sow! You ruined me! You and that savage animal you live with!" Etta didn't scream. The crippling maternal terror that once paralyzed her was gone, replaced by volcanic rage. This was her home. These were her walls. "Get out of my house, Hiram," Etta warned, her voice dropping to a booming octave that resonated through the floorboards. She stepped squarely in front of the hallway leading to Clara's room, making herself as wide and immovable as a boulder. Fletcher laughed, a hysterical sound that echoed chillingly. He raised the revolver, aiming at Etta's broad chest. "I'm going to burn this cabin to ash. I'm going to put a bullet in you, and when Cobb comes running to save you, I'll put a bullet between his eyes, too." He took a menacing step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. Etta didn't wait to die. With an explosive burst of speed that utterly defied Fletcher's arrogant expectation of a woman her size, she lunged. Her thick, powerful hand closed tightly around the handle of the smoking-hot 20-pound cast-iron skillet resting on the stove. Before Fletcher could track her movement, Etta swung the massive skillet with the full, devastating force of her heavy shoulders. Clang! The heavy iron struck Fletcher's right forearm with a bone-shattering impact just as the gun discharged. The deafening shot rang out, burying itself harmlessly into the ceiling logs. Fletcher shrieked in absolute agony, the Colt dropping from his shattered wrist. Driven by the primal instinct to protect her daughter, Etta stepped fully into Fletcher's space. She drove her heavy shoulder directly into his chest, her unstoppable weight hitting the frail banker like a runaway freight wagon. Fletcher flew backward, crashing through the ruined doorway and sprawling into the mud. Fletcher scrambled backward in the dirt, clutching his broken arm, staring up in whimpering terror. Etta stood triumphantly on the porch edge, breathing heavily. The massive skillet gripped firmly in her hand. She looked like a vengeful, immovable force of nature. "I told you," Etta breathed, her eyes blazing with pioneer fire. "Get out of my house." The frantic sound of pounding hooves echoed down the ridge. Gideon, having heard the gunshot, came tearing into the yard on his roan gelding, leaping from the saddle with his Winchester drawn, his eyes wide with frantic panic. He saw the splintered door. He saw Fletcher bleeding in the mud. And he saw Etta, entirely unharmed, standing tall on the porch. Gideon slowly lowered the rifle. The panic in his eyes melted into awestruck adoration. He walked over to Fletcher, grabbed him by the torn collar, and dragged him to the horse trough, tying him tightly to the hitching post to await the territorial marshal. Then, Gideon walked up the wooden steps. He gently took the heavy skillet from Etta's hand, set it aside, and pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace. He buried his scarred face in her neck, inhaling the deep scent of tallow and sweet bread. "Marry me, Etta," Gideon whispered hoarsely, his massive arms wrapping tightly around her sturdy waist. "Marry me today. I can't live a single day on this earth without you." Tears spilled down Etta's plump cheeks, mixing with the flour on her face. She wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, holding him just as tightly. "Yes," she sobbed, a rich laugh bubbling through her tears. "Yes, you stubborn mountain man." They were married 3 days later by a traveling circuit judge right on the porch. Historical records from the Montana Historical Society note that the Bitterroot Ridge Ranch eventually became one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the territory. Etta Cobb became a legendary figure, famously known for hosting massive harvest dinners that fed everyone from stranded travelers to the governor. But to Gideon, Toby, and Clara, she was simply the beating heart of the mountain. The frozen, silent cabin had been conquered not by bullets, but by the warmth of a mother's fierce love, the rich aroma of baking bread, and the unbreakable spirit of a woman who finally realized how perfectly she was built to weather the storm. What an incredible journey of survival, courage, and unexpected love. Etta proved that true strength isn't about fitting a certain mold, but about the sheer size of your heart and the fierce will to protect your family. If this gripping tale from the wild Montana frontier touched your soul, please drop a like, leave a comment with your favorite moment, and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling, dramatic stories that bring history back to life.
Hi, my name is Prairie Rose, the owner and manager of Obese Girl, Oregon. After watching the video, he hired the desperate widow to cook. Then her children brought his silent ranch back to life. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What touched me was the idea that a home can change when people bring warmth, laughter, and purpose into it. Sometimes helping someone through a difficult season gives us something we didn't realize we were missing, too. Do you think the children changed him as much as he helped their family? Maybe we can carry that lesson by making a little more room for others in our own lives. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts below and feel free to like or subscribe.